thank you all for joining us today. So this is our response panel. We kind of went over CoptWatch, but our panel is really meant to give us more of a diverse, two-sided perspective of the utility and the significance of human rights documentation in both the legislative or the policy-facing field, but also advocacy work. And so we are joined today by, and I'll just introduce people in order, starting with Dylan Schexnaydre. Yes. So Dylan is the policy analyst covering Syria, Turkey, and Iraq at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dylan previously covered religious freedom conditions in China, Russia, Azerbaijan, and North Korea for USCIRF, oversaw its freedom of religion or belief victims list database, and coordinated prisoner advocacy efforts. Next is Reverend Dr. Kyle Wisdom. He serves as the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Religious Freedom, where he leads research and advocacy at the intersection of religious freedom, data analysis, and international policy. He oversees the IIRF's Violent Incidents Database, a data infrastructure tracking religious freedom violations globally, and has produced country-level research reports drawing on vid data and demographic analysis. He is the author of the book Civil Religious Pluralism as Political Philosophy, an exploration of issues of religion and state within the context of Indonesia, where he lived for over a decade. He has also published peer-reviewed articles on religious freedom in international contexts and is currently co-authoring a chapter on freedom of religion or belief and atrocity prevention. And last but not least is Grace Gerardi. Grace is a legislative assistant for co-chair Jim McGovern of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. She was appointed to the Democratic staff of the commission, where she supports the co-chair McGovern's work to promote and defend internationally recognized human rights. Her regional portfolio includes South Asia, North and West Africa, and the Middle East. Grace received her bachelor's degree in international affairs from the George Washington University. So thank you all again for joining us, and I think we'll maybe start by giving them a chance to give us some opening remarks, and then I'll have a question for the panel, and we'll open it as well if there are any audience questions. But we'll start in order with Dylan.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to Coptic Solidarity for holding this event. Like Mark said, my name is Schexnaydre. I've been at USCIRF for the last 5 years now. I want to say what USCIRF is. USCIRF is a U.S. legislative branch government agency that reports and monitors on religious freedom conditions abroad. That's our mandate. That's what we do. We're not an NGO, but we're also not the State Department. We are a watchdog on U.S. government policy when it comes to religious freedom abroad. We write reports, as you might be aware of. One of the other things that Congress has mandated us to do is to document prisoners of conscience targeted on the basis of freedom of religion or belief. That includes Christians, that includes atheists, that includes people who aren't religious but criticize the government because the government is imposing religious norms or, enforcing blasphemy laws, for instance. And so, right now, we document these victims, as we call it, in our freedom of religion or belief victims list. We currently have over 2,500 public profiles that you can see on our website. These include people who are detained, imprisoned, under house arrest, disappeared, tortured, and forced to renounce their faith. Unfortunately, we do not include other incidents of religious freedom violations that it sounds like CoptWatch will document, so it seems like it would be an excellent tool to help supplement some of the work we do, and I'm sure my colleagues are looking forward to engaging with it as well. The biggest thing I would say is that our work, we rely so much on independent civil society, organizations like Coptic Solidarity. are based out of Union Station. We are in Washington, D.C. We rely so much on open source information, whether that's independent media, whether that's NGOs, whether that's even U.S. government and foreign government sources. This helps to shape our understanding of what's happening on the ground, because unfortunately we can't be there 24/7. We do travel there on occasion, and it's a pleasure to meet with activists who are on the ground, but we can't be there all the time. And so having independent, trustworthy, credible folks so that, documenting these things is critical. We would not be able to do our work were it not for these organizations. When it comes to our database, again, we take submissions from outside interlocutors. You can look at our website to do this yourself if you're interested. We also have internal processes, but like I said, we review several sources. We look at court documents as well as open source reporting. We also meet with family members, which is really important. But as I say, or as I switch a little bit more, that's what Congress has mandated us to do. But what's the point of it then? There are several things that, at least I think, that USCIRF thinks that this serves a very important tool. First and foremost, there is brutal religious freedom repression across the world. And the database, the Freedom of Religion and Belief for Victims list, allows us to put a face to some of this brutal repression. Our database is not comprehensive. There is no way we can document tens of thousands, if not millions of people, I would say just in China alone. But even globally, it is such an undertaking. And so our database, for our hopeful purposes, is to be representative of what's going on in a given country. With that being said, sometimes for our purposes, when deciding whether or not we recommend countries or for special watch list or for country of particular concern, we can see trends sometimes when we're adding people to our database. I think of Nicaragua. When I first started at USCIRF about 5 years ago, we really didn't have too much documentation on Nicaragua. And then all of a sudden, the government over there is arresting dozens and dozens of priests and other Catholic religious leaders. And so at the same time, it's not comprehensive, but we can see an uptick in how we monitor things, and it could be a tool for us to say, whoa, things have gotten pretty serious over there, and our internal processes are really identifying that. I've already mentioned Congress. Congress pays attention to our work as well. We've seen this with resolutions that are introduced about human rights and religious freedom abroad. They're counting how many prisoners we're putting in the database. They're looking at our recommendations for who's a religious freedom violator. And so that's where our work also becomes important as a resource for Congress. We've also worked extensively with the Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I'm looking forward to hearing Grace's remarks in terms of coordinating some prisoner advocacy there as well. Again, as I conclude my remarks, I would just say again, we can't do our job without robust, independent civil society organizations. And you can see based off of, certain countries have stronger civil societies than others. And when those countries slowly crack down on their civil society, we see less reporting, we see less oversight, we see less documentation. And so again, just want to emphasize that as strongly as possible. So again, thank you, and thank you to the Coptic Solidarity for having me.
Hi, I'm Kyle, here representing the International Institute for Religious Freedom. So we are a religious freedom think tank pursuing religious freedom for all peoples everywhere. And we have a database. So I just want to congratulate Coptic Solidarity. It's hard work to put together methodology, code book, analysis, viable workflow. We know because we did it, and it's hard. So it was interesting to just internally reflect on choices we've made and what we've done, and then I think maybe perhaps the privilege of focus that you guys have and the level of depth that you're able to do that we just could never do. Tracking a case through, that's really technically difficult, and I wonder how many cases will just all have NA, because when do you know that they're ever done? So we do a lot of tracking with the violent incidents database. We're not able to go as deep as you are, so I'm looking forward to a conversation about some data sharing. Beside just kind of collecting information for nerds and fellow nerds, why should we do this? I think the important thing for me is that we need to bring reality into the picture. In many of these places, right and wrong just get lost in narrative wars. And whoever holds a microphone, whoever has the most power, gets to put out their narrative. And there's huge power imbalances. So governments obviously have the clearest power, they have the loudest voice, and minority groups all around the world have to be very judicious to use their small opportunities for influence, and they don't have the resources to launch their own narrative campaigns and change the way everybody thinks about, like, Coptic believers, for instance. A lot of my remarks, which I'm adjusting on the fly, follow similar to the MP from Canada, because he was talking about moving beyond anecdotes, and Mark brought that up too. And it's important, but anecdotes, they resonate with us because we're storytelling people. We run on stories, whether we're aware of it or not. We're made to live and hear stories and tell stories, and the impact on individuals' lives are so important, and a single family is so important. But when it comes to advocating for policy or pushing for legal changes, it's easy to just write off an individual and say, well, that only happened because of this, and you can just ignore them. But thoughtfully collected data, when presented fairly, with integrity, really complements these other stories with numbers, dates. For some reason, there are people in the world that think something is more true if it's a number instead of a word. I don't know why, but that seems to be part of the human psyche. And these patterns can give recommendations for policy and give ground to stand upon for making good changes. And you sort of give tools to legislators who want to do the right thing and now maybe have a little evidence to back up what they want to do. And then structured, reliable data only grows over time. It can clarify problems that emerge, as you mentioned, with patterns. When paired with a fit-for-purpose methodology, data can be used to tell lots of stories with compatible evidence that can be turned into reports and policy recommendations and briefing documents, advocacy campaigns, all sorts of things. And you could go to governments, religious leaders, constituents, civil society. You have something to do. So the IIRF, we really commend CoptWatch and this database. It's nice to have other partners in the work, and we welcome this unique contribution to the religious freedom landscape. If we want to move beyond narrative wars or just anecdotes, we have to collect information on what's happening so we can bring reality into the conversation.
All right, it's so good to be with all of you today. Thank you so much to Coptic Solidarity for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's an honor to share the space with Dylan and with Dr. Wisdom. We rely so heavily on the work that USCIRF does and that folks in civil society do in order to promote international human rights at the Human Rights Commission. So, as Mark mentioned, I'm here in my capacity as the Democratic staff of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. The commission is a bipartisan body of the U.S. House of Representatives. It's co-chaired by my boss, Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, and by Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey. Our legislative mandate is to promote and defend internationally recognized human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and related human rights instruments. And so a point that I'd like to make is that human rights are clearly defined in international law. They are measurable, and we can document carefully the dimensions of these violations. And that is vital for the work that Congress does to promote human rights. Clear, accessible, and reliable documentation is really, really important for members of Congress, maybe even more so for their staff. We operate in a very challenging media environment. All of you in this room are familiar with that. There's a lot of AI, misinformation, disinformation. It's hard to tell what we can trust, especially when we are consuming so much online these days. And I'll say that, if I may say so, I think that those challenges are amplified for congressional staff. We're kind of drinking out of a fire hose. I know everyone is, but at 9 a.m. we might be thinking about the letter our boss is leading and who we can get on to, who else we can invite to sign on to that letter. At 2 p.m. we're thinking about the 20 bills coming up on suspension and how our bosses should vote and what the dimensions are of those bills. And then by the time the 3 p.m. meeting with folks from advocacy groups comes around, we're already on like the 10th news story of the day, and really need to know that the stories that we're hearing are credibly backed up by evidence. And so to the point that you made, Dr. Wisdom, stories are vitally important. This is something that my boss speaks about all the time. He's deeply impacted by the personal testimonies of victims and survivors of human rights abuses, and I think that's true for many members. That's the hook that you need in order to cultivate the empathy and the impetus for action in members. And then that is true also for staff, but we really are the ones that need the documentation to back it up. There are several considerations when it comes to the stories that we amplify as staff. We're always thinking about the reputational and political risk that could come with amplifying the wrong story, or something that is later found out to be false despite our best efforts to verify. So that's a part of it. And I will say also, just to go back, many of these concerns were already addressed by Larissa, and thank you very much for your presentation as well. And I appreciate the work that Coptic Solidarity has done to bring these considerations into the work. But another piece here that I know is a principle that you share is the concept of doing no harm. We certainly never want to contribute to harmful narratives. We don't want to amplify social media campaigns that are designed to incite fear or consternation. We also, of course, at the core of it all, don't want to do any harm to individuals who are suffering from human rights abuses themselves or to their families. We don't want to raise the risk of retaliation against them. And then most importantly, I think the third consideration here that we have is the desire to create impactful policy, which we cannot do if we don't have the requisite information and the facts to undergird that. If we don't understand what is really happening on the ground and we can't get a full picture of what that looks like, it will be very difficult for us to understand the mechanisms that we can use to promote change. And so with that, there are many more considerations as well, but I want to turn to how this shows up in our work and where documentation really plays a key role in the work of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, and that is the Defending Freedoms Project. And so, the Defending Freedoms Project is designed to pair prisoners of conscience, so individuals who have been detained or imprisoned for exercising their internationally recognized human rights and who have not advocated for violence, with members of Congress, and that both should ideally help to elevate the cases of these individual prisoners of conscience, but also really invigorate some interest in members about the international human rights system, the human rights conditions in the countries in question of DFP prisoners. In these situations, we rely on folks like USCIRF to to do that background, because as you know, anytime you have a meeting with us on the Democratic staff, we'll tell you our staff is very small. Our ambit is global. We address all human rights of all people all over the world, and we have 2 full-time members of staff on the Democratic side, 1 full-time staff on the Republican side. And so we really appreciate and lean heavily on folks in civil society to help us understand the dimensions of human rights crises abroad. We really, to your point, can't get in a depth, the depth that we would like, into country conditions. And so it's important to note that there have been 6 Egyptian prisoners of conscience included in the DFP since its inauguration in 2015, the project's inauguration. 1 is still imprisoned, that's Saif Fatin. 2 have been conditionally released, and 3 have been released. And most recently that was Ala Abdel Fattah. So the documentation that our advocacy partners provide really helps us to assure members of Congress who partner with us to advocate for these prisoners that, you know, first of all, that they are not incurring risk to their office by doing so, but more importantly, that they understand the color and the texture of the case so they can more effectively advocate for those prisoners. So, you know, we would really like to see Dr. Agostino Samaan and Saeed Abdulrazak included in the Defending Freedoms project. That is something that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has agreed to support, and we appreciate Coptic Solidarity's work to you know, incorporate these cases into the project. And we need your help to encourage other folks on the Hill to invest in human rights, not only for Coptic Christians, for Egyptians, but for all people, including here in the United States. And I'll just end by saying that the human rights system that undergirds all of this very important work is unfortunately under attack. And that's not something that's new. You know, folks who have worked in human rights for a long time can testify to the fact that China has, for a long time, worked to project its influence inside and outside of human rights bodies to avoid accountability for its abuses against Uyghurs and Tibetans and dissidents of all stripes. But unfortunately, now our own government has joined those attacks on the international human rights system. Many of the resources on which we have historically relied have dried up. We're no longer funding the UN to the degree that we should be. The Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights is struggling. We've sanctioned the International Criminal Court, several judges on the court. And even at the level of documentation, the most recent human rights reports have been gutted, and they are no longer as comprehensive as they long were. And so as a result, the work that you all are doing is all the more important today, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you to promote the human rights of Coptic Christians and for all people. And again, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm very enthusiastic about this effort. It's very impressive, and yeah, this has been great, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. I don't know if everyone got the same feeling, but that was really, really insightful. In many ways, you know, the original intention for this was to really show from both sides, kind of from the advocacy side, from the civil society side, you know, how is that important for our work? And I think Dr. Wisdom really highlighted that in the perfect way. And you know, talking more about the policy side, and I think that was again really insightful to have a more holistic view of the importance of documentation. And so in the next 15 minutes, I'm gonna just try to, instead of asking, I'll try to ask a specific question for each one of you, and you know, hopefully that even covers more. And I'll just start in the other order. I'll start with you, Grace. So you mentioned that, you know, the idea of documentation is really essential for policy making, and I was, you know, could you maybe elaborate more on that from the congressional side? How is documentation usually looked at, or how is it used to shape, you know, congressional legislative work?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'll say that in my personal experience, I haven't been responsible for bringing any landmark legislation over the finish line. So I can only speak to the accomplishments of many of my colleagues here on the Hill. But one example I would give is the Sergei Magnitsky Human Rights and Rule of Law and Accountability Act that my boss sponsored. And that legislation came from the abuse and death in prison of a Russian attorney, Sergei Magnitsky, at the hands of Russian security personnel. And Bill Browder, who was responsible for a lot of the advocacy behind the scenes on getting this legislation over the finish line, has spoken to the difficulty that he faced in getting buy-in at the State Department to really find the policy mechanisms necessary to hold the killers or abusers of Sergei Magnitsky accountable. And a big part of moving that legislation and crafting it was to identify who those people were, what the abuses looked like, the period of time over which they occurred, and that was really key to my understanding in developing that legislation, which later was expanded to the GLOMAG, or Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, to impose sanctions on human rights abusers all over the world, not just the killers of Sergei Magnitsky. And so that's one place where there's a very tangible example of just getting the buy-in is important, but also knowing who you're trying to hold accountable is obviously key.
Thank you, Grace. My next question is to Dr. Wisdom. From the perspective of international religious freedom advocacy and research, what do you think are the most important qualities of credible documentation? What would you say brings, or from your experience, has made, maybe specifically in VIT, for example, different or more effective over time?
It's a great question. I think it, as we've wrestled, I have a background in philosophy, so I'm tempted to make a philosophical reflection about modernity and like the reification of objects and how we concretize things that aren't as concretizable. But I think I'll just say, like, what we have tried to do is to increase transparency on sources. So because we're trying to, in a sense, boil the ocean or collect all religious freedom violations all around the world against all religious communities, we can't verify that. And so we just say we have a posteriori verification. So we take stuff out that we're notified about that is incorrect. So we don't just put in anything. So please let me be clear about that. We have tiered lists, we have data sharing agreements with a lot of different reputable people. We have our own methodology. It's published on our website. You can check it out and see what we do and why we choose to include what we choose to include. We chose to go for public sources. So usually media events from reputable websites, and the bigger an event, the more, so we usually prefer 2 to 3 separate sources. And then we show it to you. So if you pull up a record in our database, you see the URL, and then you can go look at it yourself. So because we can't verify everything, we sort of offset that with transparency and openness on some of our sources. I don't know if that answers the fullness of your question, but those are some brief things that we found that have really been important. And it really gets to meaning making, right? And it gets to doing something with the information. Like, you can collect all sorts of great stuff and put it in a pile, and then it sits in a closet in your room. Like, what good is that? So for us, we found going to multilateral bodies or to nation states, it was important to go for all religious communities, not just Christians or not just Muslims or not just Uyghurs, because states, whether they're true or not, see themselves as sort of the neutral conveners and like the custodians of everyone. And, you know, it's not universally true. But working within their narrative structure is one way that we found our methodology is a little bit more fit for purpose in that sense. It's like, we know who we want to influence, and so we don't want them to just take our word for it, like, oh, we counted 8,000 people that were in prison and in the year 2026. Like, so we have disaggregated information at the event level, just like you guys. And that event level distinction was really important for us, and I think really valuable for making the data more usable and building trust for people that you want to interact with it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Could you share the name of your website where people could?
Yeah, it's IIRF.global. IIRF.global. We have lots of reports we publish on our data set regularly. I just checked for Egypt from our live dashboard, and I see we have 56 public records going back to 2022, and the main perpetrator is government officials. And I think we currently have maybe 35,000 records, so it's growing.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you so much. And I think, you know, you definitely answered my question, and that was something that we had to kind of reconcile with. In last fall, actually, we had a kind of a first consultation phase. We met with a few people who had similar experience, and one of them was someone from the Tahrir Institute, and they'd worked on Ishhad, which was the database recording sectarian violence in multiple countries in the Middle East. So it had a very similar scope. And their biggest feedback to us was that, you know, and especially in this area, you can't make verification your obstacle, because in especially a place like Egypt, sometimes the only piece of news is a social media post. And it's sometimes about very serious crimes. And so your choice is to either make, you know, internationally aligned standards for verification and just forget about the cases or not include them, or just put everything in front of the audience, in front of the reader, and it's up to them to discern what is to read and what's not to. And so that was really good insight, and I think we kind of really, I think CoptWatch really resonates with that as well. So last but not least, Dylan, from kind of your USCIRF, your policy perspective, what kind of documentation do you think is most useful when you evaluate, or when, I guess, the commission evaluates religious freedom in Egypt specifically, but just in general? During that process, what sort of parts of documentation or types of documentation that help guide that process?
Thank you for that question. I have not covered Egypt for USCIRF, so I'll make that statement up front. I'll say when it comes to documentation broadly, the source is very important. The organization that's saying it, the way they say it, when you look at a source, you want to know the core facts of the case. And then when you look at the source and you're seeing those core facts of the case, how else are they talking about the victim? How else are they talking about the perpetrator? How else are they talking about the broader issue? And if that's the case too, it's also really important to see how other people are also talking about it. Because I'll say, we get reports from a lot of NGOs that have a particular perspective on religious persecution, and that's not a problem at all. It's just a matter of making sure that we understand what the facts are and then what the perspective is. And I know that sounds a little weird, but I imagine a lot of people who work in the NGO space can probably see that. And so depending on what that perspective is, is this group or this organization most reliable? How often, what's their record on being reliable? And what are other people saying about the situation? So it's a matter of kind of seeing what you can aggregate, and then if you can't aggregate, making a judgment call about the circumstances in the case, how it fits into broader patterns, and then perhaps even reaching out to people who may not be as familiar, but who could do a little bit of extra legwork. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you all again so much for your comments. I think, the really bottom line that comes down to it is that the process of documentation, if done in the right systemic way, but also in the ethical way, it could really transform the way that both advocacy operates, but how we also inform our policy, how we approach our policymakers, and so it's very promising to hear from the different perspectives, of how documentation matters on both sides. And it's very encouraging, I think, for especially our people from here, from Coptic Solidarity, who's the initiator of the project, to see that this is a right path in advocacy for Coptic people in Egypt. And I thank you again for your insight. And with that, I'll thank you all so much for attending. If you have any last minute questions, and then we'll have to wrap up because we need to tear down everything. So I will say this, maybe we can take questions a little more informally, like after, as we kind of tear down everything, because we need to leave the room by noon. But again, thank you all so much for joining us, and have a good day.